Yeah, I just want, I like saying little comments during these videos. And of course, like, I don't have a company here. I'm not fucking Blippy or, these guys yet. Like, my channel hasn't really been, I think this reading is gonna, like, overcome even my vlogs and stuff. So I don't feel afraid of doing this. Like I said, there's a car next to me. I don't have a studio of mine to read or to be annoying and just read all day or like, you know, if you're a parent, if you see your kid reading, encourage the reading. You don't say little stupid remarks or like stupid shit like um I shouldn't even make you should don't say stupid remarks like why do you read stupid stuff, or you know what I mean, like you might I don't know, like I don't know, I don't, I just encourage your kids to be happy, like I don't know, I just I don't know, I think if you see your kid working, don't even if they listen to music, say, hey, don't be like, why are you listening to music, music's stupid, or if you think music in general is not stupid, if you want to encourage them to do more positive music, like if your kid's reading like super horrible about murder books about murder and shit like that, like say, maybe you want to read something a little more classical, something, or even if they didn't want to read those type of books, like encourage them, you write your own horror stories or write your own, like, because why else are you just gonna read those crazy stories about murder and love triangles and shit like that, or like those modern books that they have nowadays, like these books are old. So and you encourage your kid, like, use your imagination, or is it just something you like? You like, some people have all these different odd stuff. Like life could get boring, so maybe they want to read those type of books that are more like descriptive and like murderous and sci-fi, science fiction, and or whatever. But I don't know. I just don't be like, oh. Some little remarks could really can really say disfigure somebody's ideas in their head. Some could really confuse somebody, could really discourage them, could really like just kill their whole bubble, burst the whole momentum, and all right, so this is chapter 5. He was going down grade, making 90 miles an hour, when his whistle began to scream. Dixon sang. He was found in the wreck with his hand on the throttle. He broke off, panting. It was hard work walking up the dry, sandy track to the Welch's house, especially with so much beer distributed about his frame. A dreamy smile stretched his face in the darkness as he savored again, in retrospect, that wonderful moment at 10 o'clock. It had been like a first authentic experience of art or human goodness. A stern, rapt, almost devotional exaltation, gulping down what he'd assumed must be his last pint of the evening. He noticed that drinks were still being ordered and served, that people were still coming in, and their expressions were confident, not anxious, that a new sixpence had tinkled into the works of the bar billiard table. Illumination had come when the white-coated barman struggled in with 2 fresh crates of Guinness. The little town and the city were in different counties. The local pubs, unlike the city pubs, and the hotel he went to with Margaret, stayed open till 10:30 during the summer, and the summer had now officially begun. His gratitude had been inexpressible in words. Only further calls at the bar could pay that happy debt. As a result, he'd spent more than he could afford and drunk more than he ought, and yet he felt nothing but satisfaction and peace. Rebounding painfully from the gatepost, he began creeping round the cobbed environs of the house. The large, long room at the back, where the music had been going on, was in darkness. That was good. Further around, however, where the drawing room was, there were lights, and he soon found voices in conversation. Peering through a chink in the curtains, he saw Welch in his crimson-striped blue raincoat and fishing hat, just going out of the door, followed by the local composer and Cecil Goldsmith, both of them also dressed in raincoats. People were evidently about to be driven home. Dixon grinned as he imagined the sort of drive Welch would give them. Carol, in a light tweeded coat, stayed for a moment to exchange a last remark with Bertrand. Nobody else was in the room. The large, long room at the back, where the music had been going on, was in darkness. That was good. Further on, however, the drawing room was. Okay, so a nearby window was open, but Dixon couldn't catch the words now spoken by Bertrand. He could tell from their intonation, however, that they formed a question, to which Carol said, "Yes, all right." At this, Bertrand stepped forward and put his arms around her. Dixon couldn't see what followed because Bertrand had his back to the window. But if there was a kiss, it lasted only a moment. Carol freed herself and hurried out. Bertrand went too. Dixon went back to the music room and got in through the French window. What he'd seen had disturbed him in some way he couldn't tie down, though theoretically inured to that kind of activity. He found a close proximity disagreeable rather than anything else. To have seen and talked to Cecil Goldsmith several times a week for some months didn't make the fellow any less a non-entity, but it gave him a claim on one, a claim which was somehow invoked by the sight of his wife being handled by a third party, especially that third party. Dixon wished he hadn't found that gap in the curtains, then thrust the matter from his hand. All his attention would be needed for the operation of getting up to his bedroom undetected. Deciding that the small risk of someone coming into the music room had got to be faced anyway, Dixon groped through the darkness to an armchair, lay back in it, closed his eyes, and heard with satisfaction the sound of Welch's car being started up and driven away. After a moment, he felt as if he were if he were heeling over backwards, and the pit of his stomach seemed to swell so as to start enclosing his head within it. He opened his eyes again, making his tragic mask face. Yes, it had after all been a bad idea to take that last pint. He got up and began a skipping with arms raising exercise he'd learnt all about in the RAF. 500 skips and raising of the arms had helped to clear his head before. After 180, an unclear head seemed much preferable to more skips. It was time to move. Halfway across the hall, he heard the sound of Bertrand's laugh, but well muffled by an intervening door. He creaked up the stairs and across the landing through some architectural vagary. His bedroom could only be approached by way of a large bathroom, the outer door of which he now tried to open. Nothing happened. The bathroom was evidently occupied. Perhaps Johns had decided to blockade the bedroom allotted to the defacer of his periodical. Dixon stood well back, straddling, and raised his hands like a conductor on the brink of some thunderous overture or tone poem. Then half conductor, half boxer, went into a brief manic flurry of obscene gestures. Just as somebody opened a door on the other side of the landing, there was no time to do anything at all, except adopt the attitude of one wanting outside a bathroom. A stratagem vitiated to some extent by the raincoat he still wore. "James, what on earth are you doing?" Never had Dixon been so glad to see Margaret rather than anyone else. "Shh," she said, "get me away from here." He liked her even more when she beckoned to him and led him without more words into her bedroom. Just as he closed the door of this, whoever it was came out of the bathroom. Dixon realized his heart had been pounding. "Thank God for that," he said. "Well, where have you been all the evening, James?" Well, he told her. He commented adversely to himself on a resentful expression and manner which soon overrode his feelings of relief. What would this sort of thing be like if they ever got married? At the same time, he had to admit she looked at her best in a blue dressing gown, her brown hair tawny in places, loose from its pins and rolls. He took off his raincoat and lit a cigarette, beginning to feel better. He finished what he had to say without mentioning what he'd seen through the drawing-room window. After hearing him out in silence, she smiled slightly. "Well, I can't really blame you, I suppose. It was rather rude all the same. I could see Mrs. Nettie thought it was a bit off." "Oh, she thought that it was a bit that, did she? Where did you say I'd gone?" "I didn't get a chance to say anything. Evan told her that he thought you'd probably gone to the pub. I'll wire that little bastard's neck one of these days. I'll wring that bastard's neck one of these days. My God, that's good, isn't it? Nice friendly spirit. This ought to put me nicely in bad with the Netties. And don't call him Even or Evan. Don't worry too much." Nettie didn't seem to mind. Dixon snorted. "How can you possibly be sure of that? There's no way of telling what goes on inside the head of his, if anything. Just hang on here a minute, will you? There's something I want to do in the bathroom. Don't go away." When he came back, she was still sitting on the bed, but had evidently put on some lipstick for him. This pleased him more from the implied compliment than from the actual effect. Indeed, he was beginning to feel really good again and stayed like that, even leaning back in his chair. While for a few minutes they discussed the early part of the evening, then Margaret said, "I say, don't you think you ought to be going? It's getting late." "I know. I will in a minute. I'm enjoying this." "So am I. It's the first time we've been really alone for how long?" One of the effects of this query was to make Dixon feel very drunk, and afterwards he could never quite work out why he did what he did next, which was sitting down beside Margaret on the bed, putting his arm around her shoulders and kissing her firmly on the mouth. Whatever his motives, the blue dressing gown, the uncoiled hair, the specially put-on lipstick, the pints of local bitter, his wish to bring their relations to some crisis, his wish to avoid a further salvo of intimate questions and avowals, and his worry about his job all came into the effects were unequivocal. She put her arms around his neck and kissed him back with zeal, with more zeal, in fact, than she'd shown in any of their previous, rather half-hearted and altogether inconclusive sexual encounters in her flat. Dixon twitched off his, then her, spectacles and put them down somewhere. He kissed her again, harder. He felt his head spin, faster. After a minute or two, there seemed no reasons why he shouldn't put his hand in under the lapel of her dressing gown. She murmured some endearment and tying her arms around his neck. Why shouldn't he go on? It seemed he'd be able to, though he couldn't tell how far. Did he want to? Yes, in a way, but was it fair to her? He remembered dimly how he'd advised her not to get into even the mildest sexual entanglement for a good long time, say a year after the catchpole one. Was it fair to her? Was it fair to him? He could only just handle her as a female friend. As her lover, he'd be a cowboy facing his first and notoriously formidable steer. No, it wouldn't be fair to him, and it certainly wouldn't be fair to her, confronting her with something that could hardly fail to disturb and upset her in the short run, let alone what might happen later. No, she ought to have it. On the other hand, Dixon battled for clear or any thought. She certainly seemed to want it. He felt her breath, and soft and warm, on his cheek, and his desire, which had been failing, suddenly strengthened. Of course, all that had been worrying him was fear of a rebuff. He withdrew his hand and put it back, this time under her nightdress. This, and the shudder she gave, made his head reel the furthest yet. Too far, indeed, for him to do any more thinking. The silence roared in his ears. Some short time later, as he lay on the bed, he made a movement not only quite unambiguous, but even, perhaps, rather insolently frank. Margaret's response to it, though violent, was hard to interpret. Without hesitation, Dixon advanced further. There was a brief rolling struggle, then he found himself flung sideways with enough vigor to bring his head, with a brisk report, into contact with the bed's footboard. Margaret got off, adjusting her dressing gown, and picked up his raincoat. Go on, she said. How you go, James? He struggled to his feet and managed to catch his coat when she flung it. I'm sorry, what's the matter? Out. Her small figure was trembling with anger. All right, but I don't see. She opened the door and gestured with her head. Feet were mounting the stairs to the landing. Look, there's somebody. He found himself bundled out, his coat over his arm, his head spinning in a new direction. Halfway to the bathroom, he found himself confronted by the Callahan woman. Good evening, he said politely. She looked away and went past him to her room. He tried to open the bathroom door. It was again locked. Without thinking, he threw back his head, filled his lungs, and let loose a loud and prolonged bray of rage which recalled in volume and timbre Goldsmith's performance in the madrigals. Then he clumped down the chairs, hung his coat on a hook, went into the dining room, and genuflected in front of the fake or possibly genuine 18th century sideboard. In a moment, he'd taken a bottle of port from among the sherry, beer, and cider which filled half a shelf inside. It was from this very bottle that Welch had the previous evening poured Dixon the smallest drink he'd ever been seriously offered. Some of the writing on the label was in Romance language, but not all. Just right, not too British, and not too foreign either. The cork came out with a festive Yuletide pop, which made him wish he had some nuts and raisins. He drank deeply. Some of the liquor coursed refreshingly down his chin and under his shirt collar. The bottle had been about 3/4 full when he started, and was about 3/4 empty when he stopped. He thumped and clinked it back into position, wiped his mouth on the sideboard runner, and feeling really splendid, gained his bedroom without opposition. Here he wandered about for a few minutes, undressing slowly, thinking as best he could about the encounter with Margaret. Had he really wanted what his actions had implied as before? The only answer was yes, in a way, but he wouldn't have tried, would he? Or not so hard anyway, if she hadn't seemed so keen. And why had she decided to seem so keen after so many weeks of seeming so not keen? Most likely because of some new novelist she'd been reading. But of course she ought to be keen anyway. It's what she really wants, he thought, scowling with the emphasis with which puts this to himself. She doesn't know it, but it's what she really wants, what her nature really demands. And God, if it was due, wasn't it? After all he put up with, but was it fair to her to implicate her in this sort of situation after all she'd had to put up with? As soon as Dixon recognized the mental envelope containing this question, he thrust it away from him unopened and went into the bathroom tying his pajama cord. It wasn't as nice in the bathroom as it had been in the bedroom. Though it was a cool night for early summer, he felt hot and was sweating. He stood for some time in front of the wash basin, trying to discover more about how he felt. His body seemed swollen below the chest and uneven in density. The stuff coming from the light seemed less like light than a very thin. The stuff coming from the light seemed less like light than a very thin but cloudy phosphorescent gas. It gave a creamy hum. He turned on the cold tap and bent over the basin. When he did this, he had a correct an impulse to go on leaning forward until his head lay between the taps. He wetted his face, took a baked-like mug from the glass shelf above the basin, and drank a very great deal of water, which momentarily refreshed him, though it had some other effect as well, which he couldn't at once identify. He cleaned his teeth, and with a lot of toothpaste, wetted his face again, refilled the mug, and ate some more toothpaste. He stood brooding by his bed. His face was heavy, as if little bags of sand had been painlessly sewn into various parts of it, dragging the features away from the bones. If he still had bones in his face, suddenly feeling worse, he heaved a shuddering sigh. Someone seemed to have leaped nimbly up behind him and encased him in a kind of diving suit made of invisible cotton wool. He gave a quiet groan, but he didn't want to feel any worse than this. He began getting into bed. His 4 surviving cigarettes, had he really smoked 12 that evening, lay in their packet on a polished table at the bed head, accompanied by matches, the baked-like mug of water, and ashtray from the mantelpiece. A temporary inability to raise a second foot onto the bed let him know what it had been the secondary effect of drinking all the water. It had made him drunk. This became a primary effect when he lay in bed. On the fluttering mantelpiece was a small china effigy, the representation in a squatting position of a well-known Oriental religious figure. Had Welch put it there as a silent sermon to him on the merits of the contemplative life? If so, the message had come too late. He reached up and turned off the light by the hanging switch above his head. The room began to rise upwards from the right-hand bottom corner of the bed. He had seemed to keep in the same position. He threw back the covers and sat on the edge of the bed, his legs hanging. The room composed itself to rest. After a few moments, he swung his legs back and lay down. The room lifted. He put his feet to the floor. The room stayed still. He put his legs on the bed, but he didn't lay down. The room moved. He sat on the edge of the bed. Nothing. He put one leg up on the bed. Something, in fact, a great deal. He was evidently in a high critical condition. Swearing hoarsely, he heaped up the pillows, half lay, half sat against him, and dangled his legs half over the edge of the bed. In this position, he was able to lower himself gingerly into sleep. Chapter 5. I guess he's just drunk. Alright, I'm gonna drink a little bit of coffee, probably smoke a bowl. Peace, y'all.